Hi, I'm Alex. I paid my parents' mortgage for 8 years straight, $3,200 every single month since I turned 22. But last Tuesday night, when my mom screamed, "You're ungrateful, get out and never come back," I did exactly that. What happened next? Let me just say it destroyed their perfect little world completely. Picture this. I'm sitting at our old wooden dinner table, the same one where I'd done homework as a kid, where we'd celebrated birthdays, where I'd signed that mortgage paperwork at 18, thinking I was helping my family through a rough patch. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mom was stabbing her meatloaf like it had personally offended her. Dad kept clearing his throat, but never actually said anything. My brother Jake was scrolling through his phone, completely oblivious to the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. I'd been living in that house for 26 years, but sitting there that night, I felt like a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. I felt like an unwelcome guest who'd overstayed their welcome by about a decade. The thing is, I'd been paying for the privilege of feeling unwelcome. Every month, without fail, I'd transfer $3,200 from my checking account to theirs, every month for 8 years. That's $372 in case anyone's keeping track. I was. So, Mom finally broke the silence, her voice sharp enough to shatter glass. "Mrs. Henderson asked me today why you're still living at home at 26. What exactly am I supposed to tell her? That my grown daughter can't figure out how to be an adult?" The irony hit me like a freight train. Here I was, funding their entire lifestyle, and I was the one who couldn't adult properly. I'd been working 60-hour weeks as a project manager at a tech startup, bringing home good money, and every penny above my basic needs went straight to keeping their house from foreclosure. But somehow, in their twisted logic, I was the failure. "Maybe you could tell her that I'm the one keeping this house from being repossessed," I said quietly, not looking up from my barely touched dinner. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." I finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "When's the last time either of you paid the mortgage? Because I've got 8 years of bank statements that say it's been me." That's when Mom exploded. Her face turned this alarming shade of red, and she slammed her palm down so hard the water glasses jumped. "How dare you? After everything we've done for you, this is how you talk to us? You're ungrateful. You're selfish. I'm what, Mom? I'm the one who saved your house when Dad's restaurant started failing? I'm the one who's been eating ramen for dinner so you could keep shopping at Nordstrom? I'm the one who's been driving a 12-year-old Honda while you lease a brand new BMW. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. 8 years of biting my tongue. 8 years of being treated like a burden while literally keeping them afloat. 8 years of watching my brother Jake get praised for bringing home a decent report card while I got criticized for leaving a coffee mug in the sink. "That's it!" Mom's voice reached a pitch that probably hurt dogs 3 blocks away. "You're ungrateful. Get out and never come back. I'm done with your attitude." Here's the thing about moments that change your life forever. They're usually quieter than you'd expect. I didn't scream back. I didn't throw anything. I didn't storm out in a dramatic huff. I just stood up, picked up my keys from the counter where I'd dropped them when I got home from work, grabbed my laptop bag from the chair by the door. Jake finally looked up from his phone. "Alex, come on, she doesn't mean it." But I could see in Mom's eyes that she absolutely did mean it. This wasn't heat of the moment anger. This was 8 years of resentment finally boiling over. I was the family's golden goose, but apparently even golden geese wear out their welcome. "Actually, she does mean it," I said, my voice eerily calm. "And you know what? That's fine." I walked out of that house with nothing but my purse, my laptop, and the clothes on my back. Behind me, I could hear Dad calling my name, but his voice sounded far away, like he was calling from underwater. Mom was still yelling something about respect and gratitude, but honestly, I'd stopped listening. Do you know what it feels like to realize you've been an ATM with legs for 8 years? Because that's exactly what hit me as I sat in my car in the driveway, hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. I wasn't their daughter. I was their personal bank account that occasionally had opinions they didn't like. The next morning, I woke up on my coworker Sarah's couch with a crick in my neck and a phone full of missed calls. 12 from Dad, 3 from Jake, 0 from Mom. The voice messages were a masterclass in gaslighting that would have made professional manipulators jealous. Alex, honey, your mom was just stressed. You know how she gets when she's overwhelmed. Come home and we'll talk about this like adults. That was Dad, using his reasonable voice, the one he'd perfected during 8 years of failed business ventures. Jake's message was shorter. Dude, just apologize. You know she didn't mean it. She's been crying all morning. Which was rich, considering Jake had never once acknowledged that I'd been single-handedly preventing his childhood home from foreclosure. But Mom? Radio silence. Because in her mind, I was the one who'd crossed a line. I was the ungrateful child who'd finally shown my true colors. The fact that I'd been financially supporting the family for nearly a decade was apparently irrelevant. By noon, my phone was buzzing with family group chat notifications. Screenshots started pouring in from friends who followed my family on social media. Mom had posted a long, dramatic Facebook status about ungrateful children who break their parents' hearts, and how some people don't appreciate the sacrifices parents make. The comments were a mix of neighbors offering support and distant relatives chiming in with their own stories about difficult children. The truly beautiful part? Not one mention of the mortgage payments, not one word about the financial contribution. I'd been erased from the narrative faster than you could say direct deposit. That afternoon, Dad called again. This time, his voice had an edge of panic that he was trying very hard to hide. Alex, I think we need to sit down and discuss this situation like mature adults. Your mother? Well, she's had time to cool down. Maybe we all said things we didn't mean. I meant every word, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Did you mean it when you told me to get out and never come back? That was your mother. And you sat there and let it happen. You sat there while she screamed at the person who's been keeping this family financially afloat for 8 years. So yeah, Dad, I think we're done talking. Here's what I learned about family dynamics in those first 48 hours. When the family scapegoat suddenly grows a spine, everyone scrambles to rewrite history. Suddenly, I was the dramatic one. I was the one overreacting. I was the one who couldn't take a little constructive criticism. But you know what they couldn't rewrite? Bank statements. And boy, did I have a lot of those. I spent that weekend going through every financial record I could access. Every mortgage payment, every insurance payment, every utility bill. The numbers were staggering, even to me. I'd known I was contributing a lot, but seeing it all laid out in black and white, it was like getting punched in the gut and winning the lottery at the same time. $3,200 for the mortgage, you $180 for homeowners insurance, $220 for utilities, $150 for the yard service that kept their property looking perfect for the neighbors. Added up over 8 years, and I'd contributed over $320,000 to their lifestyle. Meanwhile, my own savings account had exactly $2,847 in it. The family group chat kept lighting up. Jake sharing memes like nothing had happened. Mom posting pictures of her morning coffee with captions about toxic people and protecting your peace. Dad sending motivational quotes about forgiveness and family bonds. Not one person asked if I was okay. Not one person acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, there were 2 sides to this story. By Sunday night, I was ready to move forward. I called my bank and asked them to stop the automatic transfer to my parents' account. The customer service representative was incredibly professional, but I could hear the curiosity in her voice when she confirmed the amount. That's quite a substantial monthly transfer, ma'am. Are you sure you want to cancel it? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Monday morning brought a new energy. I started apartment hunting with a budget that included the $3,200 I'd just freed up. Turns out, when you're not funding someone else's lifestyle, you can afford some pretty nice places. But the real revelation came when I was cleaning out my old room, the one Mom had probably already started planning to convert into her craft room. Hidden in my desk drawer, underneath years of random paperwork, I found them, the original mortgage documents from when I was 18 years old. I sat on my old twin bed, the one I'd outgrown years ago but never bothered to replace because every spare dollar went to the house payment, and stared at those papers. There it was, in black and white, my signature on the loan application, my name listed as a co-borrower, my social security number linked to a mortgage for a house I'd never actually owned. I was 18 when I signed those papers. 18 and stupid and trusting when my parents came to me with tears in their eyes, explaining how Dad's restaurant was struggling, how they might lose the house, how they just needed someone to co-sign, just temporarily, just until they got back on their feet. "It's just a formality," Dad had said. "You won't actually be responsible for anything. We just need your signature to keep the bank happy." 8 years later, I was still making those payments while they lived like they'd never had a financial worry in the world. But here's the thing about mortgage documents. When you're a co-borrower, you're not just responsible for the debt. You also have rights to the property. Rights that my parents had conveniently forgotten to mention. Rights that suddenly made this whole situation a lot more interesting. I photographed every page, uploaded everything to cloud storage, and made copies. Then I did something I probably should have done years ago. I Googled real estate attorney near me, because if my parents wanted to play hardball, if they wanted to erase me from the family narrative while keeping the benefits of my financial contributions, then it was time to remind them that I wasn't just their daughter anymore. I was their business partner, whether they liked it or not. The mortgage papers in my hands weren't just documents anymore. They were proof. Proof that I'd been manipulated, proof that I'd been taken advantage of, and most importantly, proof that I had legal standing to do something about it. As I sat there in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd outgrown years ago, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Power. For 8 years, I'd been operating from a position of obligation and guilt. But those papers changed everything. Those papers meant I had choices. And for the first time since that awful dinner conversation, I started to smile. The attorney's office smelled like leather and expensive coffee, the kind of place that charges $400 an hour just to validate what you already know in your gut. Margaret Chin-esque was everything I'd hoped for in a lawyer. Sharp, no nonsense, and completely unimpressed by family drama. She spread my mortgage documents across her mahogany desk like she was reading tea leaves. "Well, this is interesting," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "You've been making payments on a property you legally co-own for 8 years, while the other co-borrowers have contributed essentially nothing?" "That's right, and they just kicked me out of said property." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. They evicted a legal co-owner from her own property? That's bold of them. She flipped through my bank statements, occasionally making little humming sounds that I chose to interpret as promising. "Alex, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about hurt feelings or family dysfunction. This is about property rights and financial fraud." The word fraud hit me like a physical blow. "Fraud? You were 18 when you signed these documents. A minor, technically, though you'd just turned 18 3 weeks prior according to this date stamp. Your parents used your signature to secure financing they couldn't obtain on their own, then systematically excluded you from any benefit of ownership while expecting you to bear the financial burden. That's textbook mortgage fraud." I stared at the papers, seeing them with new eyes. "So what can I do about it?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since I'd walked in, she smiled. "Honey, you can do a lot. First, you can demand your rightful share of the property's equity. Second, you can force a sale if they can't buy you out. And third, if you really want to make them sweat, you can file a fraud complaint that could result in criminal charges." My phone buzzed with another text from Dad. I'd been ignoring them all morning, but this one was different. Instead of his usual guilt trip rhetoric, this message was pure panic. "Alex, we need to talk. The mortgage company called asking about payment. Call me ASAP." I showed Margaret the text. She laughed. Actually laughed out loud. "It took them 3 weeks to realize their golden goose had flown the coop? That's either impressive denial or spectacular financial irresponsibility." "Probably both," I said. "So what happens now?" Now we get this property appraised, calculate your equity share, and give your parents a choice. Buy you out at fair market value or watch their house get sold from under them. I walked out of that office with a plan, a legal strategy, and something I hadn't felt in years: complete and utter confidence. Margaret had already called an appraiser, scheduled for that afternoon. The best part? As a legal co-owner, I had every right to be there, whether my parents liked it or not. The house looked smaller somehow when I pulled into the driveway at 2 p.m. Maybe it was the perspective that comes with not feeling trapped there anymore, or maybe it was the knowledge that I actually owned a piece of it. The appraiser's van was already parked on the street, and I could see Dad pacing behind the living room curtains. When I knocked on the door, my own door, legally speaking, Mom answered with the expression of someone who'd just bitten into a lemon. "What are you doing here?" "Property inspection," I said cheerfully, stepping past her into the house I'd been paying for. "This is Thomas Rodriguez from Precision Appraisals. We're here to assess the current market value." Dad appeared in the hallway, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. "Alex, what the hell is going on? You can't just bring strangers into our house without permission." "Actually, I can. As a legal co-owner with documented financial contribution to this property, I have every right to request an appraisal. Didn't you read the mortgage documents you had me sign 8 years ago?" The color drained from Dad's face so fast I thought he might pass out. Mom just stood there opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. Thomas, bless his professional soul, stepped forward with his clipboard. "Folks, this should only take about an hour. I'll need access to all rooms, the basement, attic, and the exterior grounds. If you have recent renovation receipts or improvement records, those would be helpful." For the next hour, I watched my parents squirm as Thomas measured, photographed, and cataloged every inch of their perfect suburban sanctuary. The house I'd been eating ramen to maintain. The house where I'd been told I was ungrateful for existing. "Beautiful property," Thomas told me as we stood in the updated kitchen, the one they'd renovated 2 years ago while I was still sleeping on a mattress on the floor. "Similar homes in this neighborhood are selling for $485,000 to $520,000. Based on the condition and recent improvements, I'd estimate fair market value at $495,000. I did the math in my head. If the remaining mortgage balance was around $140,000, that meant about $355,000 in equity. If I'd paid 73% of the mortgage payments over 8 years, my share would be about $260,000, I said out loud. "What?" Dad's voice cracked. "My equity share in this house, based on financial contribution and co-borrower status, $260,000. Mom actually stumbled backward and had to grab the counter for support. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. In fact, my attorney is preparing the paperwork as we speak. You have 30 days to either buy out my share at fair market value, or we put the house on the market and split the proceeds according to contribution percentages." That's when Jake finally spoke up. He'd been lurking in the doorway, probably hoping this whole thing would blow over. "Alex, come on, this is insane. We're family." "You're right, Jake. We are family. And families don't exploit each other for 8 years while calling the victim ungrateful." I turned to face my parents, who were both staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call your mortgage company and explain why the payment was late this month. You're going to figure out how to make that payment going forward. And you're going to decide whether you want to buy me out or sell the house." "We can't afford to buy you out," Dad whispered. "And we can't afford the mortgage payments without your help." "Then you should have thought of that before you told me to get out and never come back." The beautiful thing about having the law on your side is that you don't have to raise your voice to make your point. You don't have to scream or throw things or storm out dramatically. You just have to state the facts and watch reality sink in. "You trapped me in this house for 8 years, I continued, my voice steady and calm. "You made me feel guilty for wanting independence while I funded your lifestyle. You convinced me that helping family was my obligation while never acknowledging it as a sacrifice. Well, congratulations. You're about to learn what life looks like without your personal ATM. My phone rang. "Margaret, the appraisal report will be ready tomorrow morning," she said when I answered. "How did they take the news?" I looked at my parents, both of whom appeared to be processing the 5 stages of grief simultaneously. About as well as you'd expect. Good. I'll have the demand letter ready by noon. They'll have 30 days to respond with either a cashier's check for $260,000 or written agreement to list the property for sale. After I hung up, the silence in the kitchen was deafening. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. Alex, sweetheart, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, I interrupted, was me thinking that family meant something different to you than it apparently does. I've got to go. Unlike some people, I have a mortgage payment to make on my new place. The apartment I'd signed a lease for that morning was a beautiful 1-bedroom in a converted warehouse downtown. Exposed brick walls, huge windows, and a monthly rent of exactly $2,100, which left me $1,100 more per month than I'd had in 8 years. Funny how quickly you can afford nice things when you stop funding other people's dreams. Over the next 2 weeks, my family tried every manipulation tactic in the book. Dad called with health scares that mysteriously resolved themselves when I didn't rush over with checkbook in hand. Mom posted passive-aggressive Facebook statuses about children who abandon their parents in times of need. Jake tried the buddy approach, suggesting we all sit down for a family meeting to work this out like adults. But the most telling response came from my extended family. Suddenly, aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years were calling with concern about my unreasonable behavior. Apparently, word had spread through the family network that I was being difficult and trying to steal my parents' house. What they didn't know, what my parents hadn't told them, was the part about me paying for that house for 8 years. Amazing how different the story sounds when you include that little detail. The breaking point came on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks after the appraisal. I was enjoying a glass of wine in my new apartment, finally able to afford decent wine for the first time in years, when my phone exploded with calls. First Dad, then Mom, then Jake, then Dad again. I let them all go to voicemail and listened to the messages while curled up on my new couch, the first piece of furniture I'd bought for myself since college. Dad's voice was shaking. Alex, honey, we just got the letter from your attorney. This is crazy. We can't come up with that kind of money. We need to talk about this. Please call me back. Mom's message was shorter and significantly less friendly. I hope you're happy. You're going to put your own family on the street. I raised a monster. But Jake's message was the one that stopped me cold. Alex, they're talking about taking out a second mortgage to pay you off. Dad's already called 3 different lenders. They're going to destroy their credit and lose the house anyway. Is this really what you want? I set my wine glass down and stared at my phone. A second mortgage? On a house they already couldn't afford? It was like watching someone try to put out a fire with gasoline. The next morning, I called Margaret. They're trying to take out a second mortgage to pay me off. At their age and with their income, good luck with that. Most lenders won't approve a second mortgage for people over 65 unless they have substantial assets or income. Do they? I thought about Dad's failing restaurant, Mom's non-existent employment history, and their combined spending habits. Not even close. Then they're about to learn a very expensive lesson about financial reality. The question is, do you want to wait for them to exhaust all their options, or do you want to force the sale now? I'd been dreading this moment, but I knew what I had to do. Force the sale. They've had 8 years to figure out their finances. I'm done being their safety net. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 3 weeks. I drove to my parents' house, not to move back in, not to apologize, not to rescue them from the consequences of their choices. I went to deliver news that would change everything. Mom answered the door this time without the hostile expression. She looked exhausted, defeated, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Alex, what are you doing here? We need to talk, all of us. Dad and Jake were in the living room when I walked in, the same living room where I'd spent countless evenings doing homework while they watched TV, where I'd announced my college acceptance, where I'd told them about my first job. The room looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. I talked to my attorney today, I began, standing rather than sitting. This wasn't a social visit. She's going to file for forced sale of the property. You'll have 60 days to find new housing before the house goes on the market. Mom gasped. Dad actually started crying. Jake just stared at me like I'd announced I was joining a cult. Alex, please, Dad whispered. We're family. Families don't do this to each other. You're absolutely right, Dad. Families don't do this to each other. They don't exploit their children for 8 years. They don't call their primary financial support ungrateful and throw them out of the house they've been paying for. They don't spend 8 years treating someone like a burden while living off their generosity. I pulled out the folder I'd brought with me. Copies of every bank statement, every mortgage payment, every utility bill I'd covered. 8 years of financial records that told the real story of this family. This is what families don't do to each other, I said, dropping the folder on the coffee table. They don't take $320,000 from their daughter while making her feel guilty for existing. They don't forge signatures on mortgage documents and then pretend the cosigner doesn't have rights. Dad's shoulders started shaking. We never meant for it to go on this long. The restaurant was supposed to recover. We were going to pay you back. When? After another 8 years? After I'd given you $500,000 while living like a broke college student? I shook my head. You had 8 years to have this conversation with me. 8 years to acknowledge what I was sacrificing. 8 years to treat me like family instead of like an ATM. Mom finally spoke up, her voice barely audible. So, what happens now? Now, you learn to live within your means. You downsize to something you can actually afford. You figure out how to make it without exploiting your children. I picked up my purse and headed for the door. The house will sell for around $495,000. After paying off the mortgage and real estate fees, you'll clear about $340,000. That should be enough for a down payment on something more realistic. And you? Jake asked. What do you get out of destroying your family? I stopped at the front door and turned back to look at them. Really look at them. Dad crying into his hands. Mom staring at the financial records spread across the table. Jake looking at me like I was a stranger. I get my life back, I said. I get to be someone's daughter instead of someone's debt solution. I get to build wealth instead of funding other people's dreams. I get to be family instead of being used by family. As I walked back to my car, I heard the front door close behind me with a finality that felt like closure. The mortgage papers that had started this whole revelation were safely filed away in my new apartment, but I didn't need them anymore. They'd served their purpose. They'd shown me who I really was in this family dynamic, and more importantly, who I could become without it. The house sold 3 months later for $502,000. After all fees and expenses, my parents cleared $348,000, more than enough for a comfortable retirement if they managed it wisely. My portion came to $267,000, which I used as a down payment on a beautiful condo across town. We don't talk anymore. Not because I'm angry, but because we finally achieved something that was impossible for 8 years. Honesty about what our relationship really was. I was never their daughter in any meaningful sense. I was their financial solution. And they were never my family. They were my longest and most expensive mistake. But here's what I learned about family. Real family doesn't exploit you and call it love. Real family doesn't take your sacrifices for granted while calling you ungrateful. Real family celebrates your independence instead of resenting it. I've got that now. I've got friends who check on me because they care, not because they need something. I've got a savings account that grows every month instead of disappearing into other people's problems. I've got a home that's mine, legally and financially, with no one else's name on the deed. Most importantly, I've got peace. The kind of peace that comes from breaking generational cycles of financial manipulation. The kind of peace that comes from choosing yourself when everyone else expects you to choose them. So if you're out there funding someone else's lifestyle while they call you ungrateful, if you're the family ATM who never gets appreciation or respect, if you're sacrificing your future for people who won't acknowledge your present, this is your sign. You deserve better. You deserve to be family, not a resource. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away and let people learn to stand on their own. Have you ever been your family's financial safety net while being treated like the problem? Share your story below. I read every comment, and I promise, Someone here will understand exactly what you've been through.